Good evening and welcome to the Monday, February 4, 2019 meeting of the Board of Education. Tonight is a special meeting to discuss for possible action action on the fiscal year 2019-2020 budget. But the first item on the agenda is an agenda item that we have not done in a while, several years actually. Because of the election of our former colleague Christine Cohen to the State Senate, we have a vacancy, and under the charter of the town of Guilford, it is the responsibility of the Board of Education to fill the vacancy. We asked for resumes, applications from the community. We received 11. Completed cover letters with resumes. We interviewed 6 people. One person withdrew upon discussion about the time involved. 5 people went forward, and I think I speak for everybody in saying that the quality of the people that were interested in this was outstanding. I think really there was. I think one of us came in after one of the interviews and said maybe we should all just resign and put these people on, but then we couldn't appoint anybody, so if we were all resigned. So it was a tremendous group. But we do have one candidate that we would like to move forward with, and so I would ask if there is a motion to appoint a person, a member of the community, to the vacant position on the Board of Education.
Yes, I would like to move that we appoint Richard Hirsch to the empty Board of Ed seat vacated by Christine Cohen.
Let me second that.
All right, motion's been made and seconded. I'd like just in terms of support for the motion, I'd like to just summarize Dr. Hirsch and his experience, and which really because it is so unique for anybody that's been on this board in the time I've been here in any event. Dr. Hirsch received a doctorate in education from Boston University in 1969, a master's from Syracuse in 1965, a bachelor's from Syracuse. He also currently is a lecturer at Yale College, teaching courses and working on projects in the Education Studies program. He's been a consultant for various private consulting practices. He was former president of Trinity College, a former president of Hobart and William Smith Colleges, the vice president for academic affairs and provost of Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, a professor of education at the University of New Hampshire, vice president for academic affairs of the University of New Hampshire, vice president for research and dean of the graduate school at the University of Oregon, associate provost for research at the University of Oregon. Started as a social studies teacher, actually, in high school. I guess I could skip a couple of pages here and move to the beginning, but professor of education at the University of Toledo, written numerous articles on education and principles of education. So I think it's fair to say that we have not. That Dr. Hirsch is eminently qualified for this position, and we are delighted to have you joining us. So, unless anybody has any other comments, the motion has been made and seconded. All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the motion is unanimous. Dr. Hirsch, welcome. Mr. Kazin is a commissioner of the Superior Court, which means he is authorized under law to administer an oath, the oath, and so I'd ask you to please stand there and he will administer the oath.
All right, if you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that you will faithfully discharge, according to law, your duties as a member of the Guilford Board of Education to the best of your abilities, so help you God, or upon penalty of perjury? Congratulations. Welcome aboard.
Is there what is that place?
Right.
Is there
We'll get a name plate.
There's not a nameplate yet. But
Okay.
We'll work on getting one of those.
That's fine. Actually, I think
That's
your name.
That's Mr. Baglios. I should say, by the way, Mr. Baglios is not here this evening, but he is participating by remote. He will be listening in and can comment, I think, from time to time. Obviously, if you are not at the meeting, you cannot vote, but he is participating. So, are you monitoring this? Is that part of your technology, or?
Somehow. He is here through my computer. Mr. Baglio, can you hear us?
Maybe not.
Mr. Baglio?
All right, well, he will either join us or, I mean, regardless, we will figure it out.
We'll work out the technology.
That's fine.
TBD.
TBD. All right, well, Dr. Hirsch, welcome. We are, any comment you want to make, having gotten yourself into this situation?
Only that the process was more rigorous than both of the presidencies together.
I doubt that, but that's okay. We'll take it. No, it was a good process, really, and I do mean, I mean it when I think we were really comfortable with several of the candidates, many of the candidates, and but obviously Dr. Hirsch's experience is something that we hope to be able to use moving forward. You join us in a particularly challenging time, of course, during the middle of the budget season, but it's exciting, and hope to be able to use your knowledge and your experience. All right, so turning to the budget, is there anything, Dr. Freeman, you want to say about where we are budget-wise? Any thoughts about? Well, we've talked a little bit about potential increases and potential decreases. I think one of the things that some of the board members were curious about is the special education tuition line and how comfortable we are with the number that you have included in your draft budget. I wonder if you can just comment on that.
Sure. So currently, the tuition line that we provided in your budget stands at $2.9 million. That budget line will cover all of the students who we currently have in-house, who we will continue to need to provide services for next year. Additionally, there are a number of needs that we see as currently emerging, and we believe that the dollars that are in that amount allow us to cover those needs that are likely to emerge between this time and the beginning of next school year. Mr. Bloss, you've mentioned a number of times how early we are in the process. If I could, I'd like to invite Mr. Scanziano up to the table to answer to talk about the third piece of that, which would be every year we are challenged by the unknown emerging situations. And so within that 2.9 million, we know that we will address all of the concerns that we have currently identified. We know that we will meet a number of concerns that are possible or even likely to emerge. And then the last question that I'd ask Mr. Scanziano to speak to is how much additional room we have to absorb any additional needs should they continue to arise.
So, folks, when we calculate what our current expenditures are and what we know, what we think, and what are emerging, and what are kind of in the unknown but likely to emerge category, we are at approximately $2 million in known, about $450,000 in emerging, and I am estimating a likely to emerge of approximately $350,000, which gets us to about our 2.9 mark.
Which means that next year, we are very, very thin if if all of the ones that are possible or likely develop, and then there are additional unknowns next year, we could likely be in the situation we are this year where we are again overexpended. So while this budget had some room for growth when we put it together 4 weeks ago, it almost already seems to be spent. So when I presented to you here and the slide showed that tuition was both an area where we could consider possibly adding to the budget or decreasing, I'm no longer confident suggesting that we consider that as an area where we make significant decreases. If anything, I would suggest that we hold or consider possibly adding dollars, considering on where we want this budget to fall before we bring it to the Board of Finance.
Well, I think that I completely agree with that. Some of us had a meeting with Mr. Scaziano, which was very helpful in understanding the outlook for pupil services. And one of the things that came up was that there is a particular placement which the state at the moment is refusing to reimburse us for. And the facts are all on our side here, and we should prevail in this, but in dealing with the state bureaucracy, one never knows. But my understanding, Mr. Scaziano, is that the budget assumes that we do get eventual reimbursement at the standard rates
That is
for,
correct.
in that case. But if that was rejected again, that would be what, $60,000 or $70,000 that we would be out?
Oh, it would be $80,000.
So, to me, Dr. Freeman, I think that I for sure wouldn't take anything off this number, and I'm getting a little concerned that it's too light.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, that's kind of the question. I mean, I don't know if we can assume the state's not going to follow the law.
For a third time.
For a
Yeah,
third time, right.
I mean, for us, that item falls into that bucket that we've identified as emerging. We know that should that reimbursement change in that one case, we can absorb it. It's what we're seeing in that middle, right? We know about this case, we're monitoring this case. Quite honestly, what I'm more concerned about are the ones that we have no inkling of at this time. And again, that would be families
Somebody
that move
moving
into the
in,
community
yeah,
and they have students with needs, or a current student who has a currently unidentified need that becomes emergent next year. Now, those things also work in the other direction. We could have a student or a family move out of Guilford that currently is in an outplacement, in which case we'd be relieved of that tuition. We could have students who are currently outplaced that are ready to return to the district. We work on that all of the time. Our recent experience has been that it is generally the unknowns that move us to increasing the tuition spend, rather than those unknown situations that cause us to underspend. Again, in 7 of the last 8 years, we have overspent our tuition line. We have only underspent that line in 1 of the last 8 years. And as I displayed last time, in the last several years, our overspending, the gap between what we budget and what we spend, seems to be growing. So the idea of at least holding this, if not even adding a little bit of money, might help to move us to tighten those 2 trend lines that we showed at your
Well, because
last
right
meeting.
now, in this budget, we're over $600,000+. And so the increase is really basically what we're over right now. and
Except
with-
remember that we also have students who may be aging or
Well,
graduating
true,
out. So
but it's not, that's cutting it close. In terms
Yes.
of decreasing the
Yes.
funds
So
anymore, that's cutting it pretty close.
the budget in front of you corrects for that shortfall this year and has some room for situations that are currently emerging, some of which are likely to occur, maybe all of will, but maybe they won't all occur. And so again, it is just very difficult when you're dealing with such a small number of cases, but such large dollar amounts. You know, if we added significant dollars to this budget, and then those issues are resolved, not requiring outplacement, and 1 or 2 students currently on our rolls move to another community, or we are successful in bringing them back, we could end up over budgeted and underspent. I mean, it hasn't happened that many times, but I worry about becoming too aggressive in correcting it and then moving in the wrong direction. So again, an option is simply to stay where we are. What I think we're losing as an option is the ability to reduce that line as we sit here tonight.
So is there any appetite to reducing that line?
No.
I know
No.
it's not sounding like it.
No.
Okay, so why don't we put that on hold for just a minute? And I think one place we can probably make some reductions is in the salaries line to reflect retirements. And this is a very hard line to predict. It's because the theory is that if a senior teacher retires and he or she is replaced by a less experienced teacher at a lower step, then there's going to be a savings. And now there may be an additional expense from health insurance. You know, it may or may not be less expensive for one teacher versus another teacher. So it's not a dollar for dollar trade, but there will be retirement, some number of retirements.
There are every year.
There are every year, and there will be some number of retirements that are not in the hard to replace areas, right? I mean, the math, science,
world language.
world language, that doesn't really often lead to a savings at all. But there are always some retirements. So,
Correct.
and this is just to pick a number, we have used a lot of different numbers for this through the years. Your budget doesn't include
There is
anything.
no retirement savings at all in the budget as it sits in front of you. There should be a number there.
So I'd like to suggest that we reduce the salaries line by $150,000. I think that would assume roughly 4 to 5 non-high demand teachers district-wide, and I think that's within our experience. There has been I think a year where we were less than that, but most years are either right around that or a little more. So
That's correct.
I don't know, I'm a little leery about the 150, just because we got a warning, or warning is probably a strong word. You talked to us last year about counting on retirements and replacing with newer, less experienced teachers, and I think you've already mentioned it this year a couple of times, and I don't know the numbers, but the elementary schools are fairly staffed with younger teachers, and I just have this feeling that the teachers that are closer to retirement age are subject specialist teachers, middle school, high school, that may all need higher level replacements cost-wise.
Yeah, so I don't have our staffing experience broken out that way. I could have
I mean, I'm
that
just
one, yeah.
thinking of it.
Last year, we budgeted for $125,000 in retirement savings. The ultimate figure, which we didn't actually have until the beginning of the school year, turned out to be $250,000. So I would not suggest budgeting for that. That was, I think, slightly higher than we anticipated. This being the third year of the contract, I would be cautious about teachers who might be planning retirement and wanting to work through this one last year of this contract before doing that. So I think a number south of that is going to be important. I think 250 would be far too high. I think I might be a little more comfortable around 100, but it's, as Mr. Bloss said, it's a number, and we would work with it. What I do worry about is when both salary and tuition are becoming close, because then you have the ability to transfer monies from one budget from one line item to another within the budget. When both get close, then that's becoming challenging. So to begin conversation, 150 is as good as any other number, whether we finish the night there. I think that is maybe a little higher than I would propose. My suggestion was 100, but these are only suggestions that I make for you. I think any number is a reasonable place to start.
Let's speak a little bit more about why a number is appropriate. As you just said, I echo what Amy mentioned. Last year, you were issued some pretty strong caution about future years, and we're in a future year from last year. So just flesh that out a little bit more. This year, we're here, and you're comfortable having a number. We're talking about the quantity of the number.
So, as Mr. Bloss noted, as with special education tuition, it's a difficult number to project. There are always retirements. I haven't been in the district in a year that we didn't experience some retirements. Some subject areas are easier. We have some shortage areas. Math, science, world language are all shortage areas. If we were to have retirements in any of those areas, to be competitive, we would likely have to offer to hire a person with experience. And we have been successful in hiring people from other districts who want to be part of Guilford schools. It's unlikely that we would be able to hire a first-year teacher or a teacher with a few years of experience in any of those subject areas that would meet our expectations. In other subject areas, like English Language Arts 712, the certification area I hold, social studies, elementary certification as examples, it's actually a really competitive field. There are lots of people holding those certificates who are looking for a job. And for an elementary classroom, we often draw 100 applications for any opening. So the likelihood there of finding really talented young employees is very likely. Year over year, as we have taken retirement savings, I have directed principals in those areas to keep out a very low hiring cap. And in fact have suggested not to look at candidates with 6, 7, 12 years of experience. What happens year over year as you hire is you begin to get a less experienced workforce overall. And the younger teachers in the building have fewer veteran teachers they can go to be mentors, to ask questions, to rely upon. Additionally, what you begin to see is a more volatile salary line, as we've seen, because less experienced staff members have step increases year over year for the first 11 years. If you bring in more experienced staff, they hit max hire, which is a higher expenditure overall, but a less volatile line because you have a quarter or a third of your staff who are getting very small increases year over year. And then the same applies to degree changes. So I do believe that every year we need to recognize a salary savings. I just think it's difficult to predict. And so if we were talking about $100,000, you'd be looking at maybe 3 such retirements. And if we're looking at $150,000, we're looking at maybe 4 such retirements. We don't have a incentive currently in district to be notified of those things early. And there tends to be a culture in Guilford that many of the retirements were notified of late in the school year. I think teachers don't like to be the center of attention, bless you, and oftentimes make those announcements. Again, we do budget very early. Our budget is done, and then those announcements begin rolling into our office. So we're working with a projection once again.
Very helpful in hearing that analysis and balancing all the factors. There would be a certain logic to going to the same number as last year, 125 rather than 150, and it turned out to be half of what the actual savings were last year. But 150, this isn't a science when you get to these
no,
numbers
this is-
at all, and no one
No,
believes it is.
it's an estimate.
We don't want to be too aggressive if we can avoid it.
Yeah, as long as, as long as we get.
As long as we then have a budget that the community is willing to support and
Correct,
pass.
what I was going to say. Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And I will note, if I will note that, I mean, I think we're talking about, right, 2 of the most volatile lines, certainly tuition.
We jumped right into the deep end in this
Well,
discussion.
right, not surprisingly. But, when I kind of pored over this proposed budget and looked at all of the other kind of categories, this is not a very flexible budget. There are salaries that, a salary line, except for this conversation about retirements, which doesn't move unless we take people out of the mix, which is not something I don't think any of us want to do, and we don't have enrollment numbers that suggest that there's a reason to do that. Employee benefits, we're already considering some reductions there. We have a purchase service line, which is basically flat. I'm a little bit concerned about about being in a position, much like we are this year, with a $600,000 to $700,000 overrun on tuition, and not having the flexibility in the rest of the budget, which is not what it's there for, but really getting stuck because there's just not other places for that movement. That doesn't necessarily land me on any number either, but I do think we may need to be more cautious because, again, I just see that this budget has been so carefully crafted this year and has so little increase, except for things that are contractual, that we would really be cutting back on an already reduced situation in many cases.
The only other thing I would note, and I understand that I think I'm arguing both ends. Last year, we brought forward a 1.4% increase, and we estimate that we passed by about 300 votes. And so it really is, there's this balancing act about what is going to be supported by the community and where do we have that land. I am sensitive this year to, Katie, I agree with you that we have there's not a lot of room to move in this budget, but I'm sensitive to making sure that we have a budget that comes forward that the community is willing to rally around and support.
No, I hear that. Yeah, no, I think you're right.
So let's talk just briefly about one of the things that Dr. Freeman had proposed as a possible increase, and that is to adding buses. Actually, are we finished asking questions of Mr. Scanziano?
I know, not necessarily.
You're entitled. You can sit there if you want. But
Thank you.
Thank you.
one of the things that we had asked for information about was whether we should add buses to try to alleviate the transportation time, particularly at the elementary school level, but it would mean adding 4 buses, because you'd have to do one for each school district.
To have any significant impact, I
Right.
believe so.
And the total would be $240,000. That would be about a half a point, or 0.4% in our budget. We didn't really hear much from the community about that, honestly.
No, after I did note that in my presentation, but there was not a single comment made in either of your public hearings last week on that topic in either direction. And I would note that, again, the buses are clearing the roads by 4:30 regularly. We had a rough start to the school year. I don't believe that we've made significant gains, but I don't believe that we lost a lot of performance as a result of the schedule changes or the transition to the new bus company once we got beyond that transition period of the first 2 months.
So does anybody think we ought to move that forward to the Board of Finance? No?
I do not.
Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. Want to talk about art? Let's talk about art. Shall we talk about art?
Sure.
Okay. So there are a few different possibilities now. I mean, we heard very loud, I think, from the community how interested people are in additional art instruction, additional means to incorporate art within the regular classroom. And I actually looked at the core standards on art over the last week, and they actually don't talk about contact time, but they do talk about proficiency. They do talk about how to, and it's clear that it's supposed to be within the non-art classroom as well as the art classroom. There are a couple possibilities, and I think we've heard you, Dr. Freeman, when you and the principals, frankly, when we met with the principals, I expressed some significant concern about an already busy day made busier, and how do we handle that? I know that there's been some question about whether there is a way to incorporate some kind of an I don't know what to call it exactly, an integration specialist, an art teacher to assist classroom teachers in implementing art instruction within the regular classroom, which I guess I think I understand it, and then there's been a third comment or a third possibility put out. And this revolved around the whole question about whether the fact that our school day is short and adding time either to the regular school day, which we're just not in a position to do. I don't think anybody thinks we're in a position to do that, and wouldn't do that without significant parental input. It's just not the way we do things.
Well, and it would take, we'd have to talk to the unions, and that would be a complicated undertaking.
The parents would be my primary, I think. From a contract point of view, I think we'd be okay. But from the parents' point of view,
would want that to be a process.
Yeah, and obviously we'd want to talk to the teachers and work through it with them.
Right,
But I think that's not the major problem or the major barrier. The major barrier is I think we hear that the elementary kids are getting home late as it is. And if we added 15 minutes to the school day to do more recess or more art, maybe parents would support that, maybe they wouldn't, but I think that's a not a good way to try to move in that direction as part of the budget process. If we're going to move in that direction, we need to move as part of a more deliberate process where we think about the alternatives.
Correct.
So what I would like to suggest, I just don't think we're ready to add 2 full-time art teachers, in my opinion, because of the time problems or time constraints that we heard at the elementary level. I also don't think we're in a position to add an incorporation specialist, but I think that and we talked about this at our last meeting, I think that we and I would hope the administration would be open to this, but it seems to me there are two different issues. One is the elementary school day used efficiently? And is there room to do something different without taking away from something that's meaningful instructionally, but increase the amount of either contact time with art or art incorporation into the regular classroom, or both? So that's the first question. Is the day efficient, and can it be more efficient, or are there time-related alternatives that we can do? Second is, what is the best way to encourage regular classroom teachers to incorporate art? What are we doing on that in terms of professional development? What do the standards say? I understand we may be having unless she changes her mind, we'll be having a new associate superintendent for
I'm working on it.
fairly soon, and that person may have views on it. That's effectively a kind of almost a professional developer kind of, and that's a very specialized area. We just haven't talked about that. And I guess what I'm getting at is this process should be happening through the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Committee rather than
Correct.
the Budget Committee, because it is fundamentally a curricular question, and making trade-offs, because if there's going to be more art contact time during the school day now, then there's going to be less of something else.
Correct.
And maybe it's numerosity, maybe it's literacy, maybe it's recess, maybe it's music, maybe it's something else, a foreign language. If that is going to happen, it ought to happen as part of the curricular discussion rather than a budget discussion.
Correct.
So, but I think there is a way to provide at least more opportunity for some children to do more contact time in art, and that is to kind of follow the same model as for extracurriculars at the middle school and at the high school. And I'd be open to adding some money for stipends for teachers or teachers, I guess, or anybody else in the community assuming the teachers have first shot at it,
Right.
I would guess, under the contract. But adding money into the budget to set up after-school art clubs at each of the elementary schools on terms to be decided, but I'd be open to that. I'd also suggest that we ask the superintendent to form a committee to talk about the two issues that I think we've been very interested in, and that is there a way to add more contact time for art in the elementary school day? And what is the best way to integrate art into the regular classroom? And then with an intention that it then go back through the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Committee for a recommendation to the board, so that we can act responsibly moving forward. So I know this is kind of a long proposal, but yes.
But, no, we can respond to that exactly as you've laid it out. I say this completely respectfully, but one of the things that's going to happen regardless of the decision we make here on the budget is we've heard loud and clear about the importance of art at the elementary level, and we will be working on more intentionally and overtly encouraging the regular classroom teachers at the elementary level to address the art standards in their daily instructional practice. And we've already begun thinking about ways to do that, debriefing one of the district-wide units through that lens, and reporting out to the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Committee on that at their last meeting. So that's a given. We will work in that direction to do better in that area. We're happy to bring together a group that will look at elementary schedules, to look at opportunities to facilitate that work, to support that work, and to look at how we're offering art as a pullout, and are there ways to leverage the time that we have, to buffer the time that we have, to address concerns that we've heard about passing time, about setup and breakdown. We'll absolutely look at that. And again, after the level of interest that we have heard, I won't just be asking in-house people to look at that. I'll certainly be reaching out to some community members so that we have that voice as part of that conversation next year. And then Mr. Bloss, at the last conversation, we talked about the club opportunity opportunity. I would suggest that a number of $10,000, while you're right, I will have to negotiate with the union. We don't have clubs of that the Teachers Association rather. We don't have clubs of that nature at the elementary level, but that dollar figure should allow for 2 teacher stipends and then some material costs. And I would think that with 2 teachers available in the afternoons, we would be able to provide opportunities weekly or biweekly at all 4 of the elementary schools. And again, I'll have to do the specifics will have to be determined, but that dollar amount would give us room to create those opportunities in the short term. And then as a positive, the elementary day being at the end of the school day, we would have to notice these opportunities to all teachers within the bargaining contract. But the good news there is that opens up all certified art teachers at the elementary, middle, and high school levels to express an interest in working with students in those ways. So it could in fact end up being 2 individuals or 4 individuals if we decide to break the dollars up in that way. And that to me seems like an exciting opportunity. It's not everything that the community spoke about, but I think in concert with integrating better and more intentionally in the classrooms and looking at how to be more efficient with the schedule and possibly revisiting this next year if we believe that we can address the concerns. The music teachers that were added last year were ultimately added after about 7 years of discussion and request before we got to that decision.
We're not saying this
I'm
will
not
take 7
suggesting that
years.
but I'm suggesting that we can make some thoughtful intermediate steps as we work in that direction. And again, considering the other pressures on this budget that I mentioned and the time, the shortness of the school day, I'd rather begin in this direction than talk about carving more time out for art, which would mean we'd have to immediately find it from somewhere else. And I'm more concerned about the time than the dollars, quite frankly.
Yeah, I would agree with your point about being more curricular than budgetary, because of course we could decide to put the money in the budget and you
Sure.
still wouldn't be able to fit it into the curriculum without
Without giving up
making
somewhere
some
else.
changes. So I agree. The other point that, wouldn't directly affect art, but may over time, but it would affect other specials and other classes, really, in the elementary school. A parent at last week's meeting came up and spoke and had an interesting idea about turning the elementary school schedules. Currently, they're 5-day-a-week schedules, like a work week. And at the middle schools, on up to the high school, they run on a 6-day schedule with letter days. So the parent that commented, her point was that her child has art on a Monday. And because most of the holidays or long weekends fall on a Monday, her student is missing out on a lot of art just because of the calendar. And if the elementary schools went to letter days, they would rotate around and that would be less likely to happen. So I thought that was a really interesting idea. That would probably just take a little planning,
I
but
think that's
not.
part of what the committee would
Absolutely,
look
there's
at. Yeah.
discussion with the elementary principals. I want to model it out. I'm not sure that it would increase contact time, but it would absolutely address the concern
Right.
about a class scheduled for Monday getting missed more often than a class scheduled for a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So I haven't followed up with the elementary principals since that comment was made, but fully intend to.
Yeah, at the least, it's a good example of the type of, we're in the information
Yep.
gathering stage, we need to do more, it's a process.
Yep.
And I think funding the clubs is a good interim measure to accomplish something along the way.
Well, and I think it's important that, we've heard from the parent body, and it's important that we implement some steps now. And there are others that I think require us to be more cautious, and we need to study this and work it through. I agree. The idea that we're going to reduce the amount of time we spend on math because we're going to increase art, that's a kind of a decision you don't make just on the spot. That really takes some thinking. And changing the length of the school day for the elementary, now that would take a lot of planning. So the things that we're talking about here are things that we can do for the coming school year and are, along the way of addressing the issues. So I think this is a step in the right direction, but we got to keep working at it.
I agree. I think it's a good start. I think it's also a commitment. We really heard from some really eloquent, passionate parents. I was so impressed with the level of experience and understanding of art in our community. And I think having a committee with people who have a real knowledge base here to collaborate with us, we could really gain in our district and really learn from that. And I mean, this is a start, and I think we can keep going forward. I think it's really exciting, actually.
I agree.
So so just to kind of on your chart here, if, just add in $10,000,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, and so I think some of the other things that I've heard people talk about is there is, under the site improvements line, there is $100,000 for bleachers at the high school for the
Turf field that's currently offline.
the soon-to-be turf field. There's once upon a time and soon-to-be again turf field, I guess. And
Our
I-
secondary turf field.
Secondary, yeah. And I think there's, I mean, from talking to a couple of people about that, I think there's some ambivalence about that. You know, given that it is, first of all, it's not in use yet. Second of all, it's going to be mostly a practice field, probably.
Right.
And there may be a time to do that, but it's probably after it's up and running and we see how it's being used. And so I think the question is, does everybody agree that that's probably not a good way to spend $100,000 this year?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, I mean, is it an accurate assessment that it will likely primarily be a practice field, or is that?
It will be a
Wait.
game field, but only during daylight. There are no lights on it, and so it could never host after-dark games. We
Okay.
will certainly use it as, but it will not be our primary game space. That will remain the original field. But it can host I think it's likely to assume it'll host some JV events, but again, only during daylight hours.
And then it's
Okay.
also used on weekends. For
Yes, it will
town
host
sports during the
school
day, right,
practices,
right.
school uses, as well as community uses during daylight
Yeah,
hours.
clubs
Okay.
and stuff like that.
But I agree, Mr. Bloss, I'm not arguing for the bleachers. I agree that delaying the bleachers at this time is a reasonable reduction.
So then the question is, do we take 100,000 out of the site improvement line or something less than 100,000, recognizing that there are other site-related needs in the district, and that if you add that entire 100,000 in a year or two, then it's percentage-wise a larger increase. Having said that, again, I want to just keep everybody focused on the fact that we've still got 2 years of debt service increases for the high school before they start to go down. And then, so there's an argument that we should try to postpone as much as we can until after the debt service starts to decline.
I am noting that if we take 100,000 out, we actually are then funding that line at a lower dollar amount than we did last year, which
Is
goes a little
contrary
bit.
to our
it's-
trend.
Right, well,
But we were
it's
trying to
contrary to our
increase, right?
intended trend, right?
Right,
It's not just a
exactly.
trend, it's an intentional trend,
Right.
an intentional commitment to try to put monies in that line and really take care of the needs, the physical needs. So I'm questioning whether we want to take a full 100,000 out of that line.
The whole line increases by $92,000, so I would suggest that there be a reduction of something less than $90,000. I would suggest something like $40,000 or $50,000, which allows us to make progress building that line back up. But again, I know that there's pressure between the overall reduction that we're trying to work towards and not reducing any single line by too much. But $40,000, $50,000, I think, is a reasonable, and then we will take the bleachers off of our to-do list, but there are other projects that we would be happy to return to the list, and we will get other projects completed this year, other smaller projects.
What about $75,000? Where does that bring us in comparison to Katie's point of last year's funding and this year's funding, if we did that?
It increases by 17,000.
So, given the numbers we hope to reach, and given that we don't want to reverse if possible. Facilities spending, I would propose a $75,000 deduction, still leaving 15 of the amount allocated to bleachers to be reallocated to other facilities. Improvements.
25,
25.
yeah.
Well,
No,
Paul
but
indicated
only
it
a
was
90,
actually
it's on,
90.
we only have a 92
Oh, 90,000, yeah,
increase
okay, you're right, you're right,
over
you're right.
last,
Yep, you're right.
over
It
last
it
year.
was phrased as
Right.
100 at
Yes.
one point,
Right.
but
Yeah,
90
no,
is
no,
the.
no.
So,
Well, let's kind of keep working through and see.
Yeah,
if,
let's
uh,
see, right, because it's a piece of a whole
We don't do
here.
line items, right?
That's
We
right.
do
No, that's right, it's a
global.
piece of a whole.
Yeah.
right.
And so I think that we've identified a couple of other areas to look at. One is pension contribution, one is health insurance, or health benefits. And so, what was the recommendation as to the pension contribution was from the committee?
If you look at the number that's in the budget, it includes three things. It includes the amount that's actually going to be added to the pension account. It includes a fee for the actuarial work that they do during the year to help us figure out what, if somebody retires, what they're entitled to and that sort of thing. So the key number is, what are we adding to the pension reserve? And right now, that number is $700,000. The actuaries have been very clear to us that the number that they're recommending is $856,000. So we're $156,000 short of what the actuaries are recommending. The town has been very scrupulous about funding the actuary recommendations. We have been below that for at least the last 7 or 8 years. And my recommendation is that if anything, that we should increase this line. Now, I understand we're under some budget pressure, so that's probably not going to work, but I would be very, very hesitant, Mr. Chairman, to talk about cutting this line.
Okay, well, let's talk about, we can always cut 10,000 from a line here or 10,000 from a line there. It's not particularly meaningful, frankly. The other line the other large line is the health benefits line, which we have had a relatively positive experience with here this year. We have, and for people that have not been on the board for a long time, I want to remind everybody that it was different once upon a time. Not that long ago, we were in a very dire
In a
deficit
when I came on
situation.
board.
That's correct, and a significant deficit, multi-million-dollar deficit, as I recall, or over $1 million. And because of some changes and cooperation from the various bargaining units and a recognition that the model wasn't going to work or keep working, it's now in decent shape. So I think, I understand that this is
It's a projection.
It's a projection,
Yes.
and I guess I'm channeling Mr. Potocny. It's what was his language? It was always
With words.
an estimate, a blueprint, a desire. It's something. It's
He had a number of different terms for,
It is a plan for our spending, but a number of our items are projections, yes. And
and
so,
they're all projections, and the fact is, we've never hit any of these exactly.
Exactly.
You can't, not in a $60 million budget.
but to your point, Mr. Bloss, we do currently have a surplus in our health benefit account. We are self-insured, and the number that you have in front of you, while it already shows a reduction over last year, again, is a projection. And if we need to make projections and we're deciding whether to make a slightly more aggressive projection in an area like health insurance that is supported by a fund from which we make our payments that is now in surplus, or tuition or salaries where we aren't supported by a fund of that nature, then I would suggest that we could make a reduction to the health insurance line. I wouldn't suggest that we do something in the area of six figures, but I think that any reduction south of $100,000 is something that we could absorb. We will monitor it closely. We get excellent support and consultation from Joe Spurgeon. And should we end up missing on that line, we do have a fund that is currently in good shape, and we could make an adjustment, a correction next year if necessary.
So I'm almost exactly on the same page with you, but I actually think that six figures is exactly where I was. Right at 100,000, I think would be reasonable, given what the surplus, the fund balance is. What do you think, Ms. Trudeau?
Just looking to see how green Mrs. Trudeau is.
She'll be fine.
I guess I'll be fine.
I just don't think that's irresponsible at all. We've had a
several
good
good
experience
years.
this year. We took money out of that account last year to put into the pension.
To the pension fund.
And if this was 10 years ago, I'd say I wouldn't be making this suggestion. You know what? 10 years ago, this discussion about this line was the discussion we were having about the tuition line.
Yeah,
Right? You remember
that's
that? That was the line.
That was the one you couldn't predict.
You couldn't predict it, except that it was going to be way higher than we budgeted. That's the only thing you could predict.
Yep.
It was completely a different history. This is, and I just think it would be responsible to reduce that by $100,000 myself.
Okay.
Does anybody have any real strong feeling about that one way or the other?
I don't. I mean, I think, sorry, because I think of this, again, as all parts of a whole. I hear very clearly what Ted's saying about the pension. I know in the past, sometimes we've decided to take a little bit out of the pension line with the plan of putting any kind of surplus, and I don't know if surplus is the right word, but whatever we might have. Unexpended funds is a much better and accurate depiction. If we get to the end of our fiscal year and have unexpended funds, that we would put it in that, put it towards the pension. And so I was prepared to suggest a 50,000 cut in that line with that plan in mind. If we as a board are not comfortable with that, then I would be apt to then support Mr. Bloss's suggestion of 100,000 from the health insurance. If we're not, if the rest of the board is interested in keeping that pension line as it is presently proposed.
Well, I would point out that our unexpended number last year was less than $10,000. And we were lucky that it wasn't a negative number.
Was that after
No, it
making an
can't be a
additional pension
negative number.
contribution?
Yeah, that was after the
That
The
was
pension
after.
contribution was made
It
from
was
not
the year-
doing the
it was the year
medical the year
previous that
before
we
we
made
did
it.
the additional.
No, we
year-
didn't make a pension
no, the
contribution last year.
Yes, we
We
did.
had
2 years ago. 2 years ago, we made an additional contribution at the end of the budget year from our operating budget. Last year,
Correct.
we made an additional contribution, as you noted, Mr. Bloss, with funds that were taken from the medical line.
Correct.
Right.
So we've made end-of-year contributions
To
2
the
years in a
pension.
row.
Two
That's
years
right.
in a row.
Yeah.
That's
From two
right.
different sources.
From
That's
two
right.
different sources. But look, it really truly doesn't matter that much, because we know what the pension responsibilities are going to be. We're going to have to keep them. We're going to have to meet it. And we've got about 7 years, I think, as I understand it, to make sure, right? 7 years or so, and to make up any deficit. But it's manageable. We'll be okay.
Our unfunded accrued liability right now is almost $2.5 million in the pension fund.
And it was in the threes last year.
It was just under 3 last year.
So
The
making
plan is
the-
right now 85.16% funded,
Well, okay.
which is,
And Linda, my understanding is to keep it at that level would require an investment of $500,000. If we want to raise that level we need to get to 100 in 7 years.
the normal cost of the plan is $405,826.
So,
That's
Anything
just to
over
keep
that-
it running.
Anything over that number moves us towards closing that gap. It's a matter of what will it take to close that gap in 7 years. So they recommended 8 and change. We're at
856.
7.
868.
Could we do 650? Could we do 690? Could we do 800? Yes, right, do we want to build it into the operating budget, or put some number into the operating budget with an understanding that if at the end of the year it's a possibility to make an additional contribution, that we will.
I'm just, I'm telling you, I'm nervous. I agree with my colleague here that this budget is very tight. I mean, we've gone over, I mean, this is a huge book, and we have gone over this book carefully. And, I mean, looking for 5,000 here and 10,000 there. And some years in the past, you could find it. And this year, it's just not there. I mean, you've squeezed this budget down. So the idea that we're going to have money at the end of the year to be able to do things, I think is not very probable. And I continue to worry that if the tuition budget has the kind of volatility that we've seen in the last couple of years, that we may end up at some point during the year having to go back to the Board of Finance for the first time in quite a while.
I keep reminding Mr. Ailes of that.
And ask for additional money. So I'm sorry, but the idea that we're going to have money at the end of the year and that's how we're going to make up the pension, that's how we got into this $2.5 or $3 million deficit.
Well, how about any other reductions or increases that would be that people might be interested in? So we've talked about $290,000 in net reductions counted with the $10,000 increase for art clubs.
That's what I have as well.
Yeah.
Ms. Trudeau, what would that be if there was a reduction in the operating budget of $290,000? That would reduce it from 2.47% to?
Pretty close to 2.
We're at right
Just
around
under,
2.
it should be
1.98.
1.9 something.
1.98.
1.98.
1.98?
Kind of a good place to be.
And we were 1.4
We
or
were at
something last year?
1.4 last year. We will need to work to develop community support around this budget. It's a little bit higher than it was last year. We still have the Board of Finance to bring this to and present to, obviously.
Well, what do people think? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I only had one other, and it's a sort of tiny amount. We did hear, or we have heard, a couple of years in a row from representatives from the new swim team that we started a couple of years ago. And they do a lot of fundraising and different things, and they knew that they needed to do that in order to form the team, and we were pretty clear about that. Their transportation costs are pretty high because they have to go to the pool for everything.
We're currently not providing any transportation.
Correct.
Most teams don't have practice costs, but all other teams receive transportation to all of their events.
And I know the number that they gave us was a good sized number, so I don't know that I would support all of that, but wondering if $2,000 to accommodate away meets, not practice.
We asked
would be
Mr. Jarvis to, in
appropriate.
fact, look at all home and away meets. $2,000 would cover transportation to all of their events, home or away. It would leave the fundraising responsible for practice costs, but at this point, we don't have a pool that they use in town, and so $2,000 would cover the same transportation that any other team has provided. All of their contests would be covered. It does leave the families responsible for practice transportation, but it's a step in the direction of normalizing the board's relationship with the swim team.
That feels like the start.
Yeah, I reached out to some parents of the girls' swim team, just to get a sense of, per swimmer expense, and is there equity there compared to some other, water sports, and I do know that any kind of support for transportation would be very much welcome, because they do fundraise probably on average per swimmer between, just contribution to be on the team, and then fundraising is about $1,000 a swimmer. And so it would be nice to offset that a little bit and the burden on the families. because the team has grown, and they're anticipating more growth. They have an 8th grade class that has probably 6 or 7 swimmers in it that would be coming up, so it's great that the team is thriving.
Yep.
It'd be nice to represent some support for that.
Do you need an addition into the budget for that, or do you think that the existing appropriation would cover that, or what do you think?
I mean, it's $2,000 at this point. We could work on covering it through existing, and as always, and you heard noted, in many of the athletic lines do fall short of actual expenditures,
right.
and those expenditures would be offset by gate receipts that we receive from events that we host at home where we charge an entry fee. There are a number of sports where we charge entry fees, and when we get into postseason play, we charge entry fees. So if we could not cover it out of the existing budget, should we not add an extra $2,000, it would be offset by gate receipts.
Adding it, what takes us to a 288?
It does.
Yeah, what would a 288 reduction be?
I mean, I
Stays the
still
same.
keep.
Stays the same
Yeah,
as
it's
a percent.
1.98, so I'm,
Statistically.
Okay,
yeah, I'd rather
okay. That's fine.
identify it as
Mr.
a.
Jarvis would appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I would rather.
Well, you know, speaking of, you know, a hard to predict, you'd think this would be pretty easy to predict, right? It's not. Think about, like, in any one sport, a team might not go to any regional tournaments or
That's
postseason tournaments.
And
They
this was
might
the other
go.
thing, the team has had a lot of success. They went from being in a certain place to 3 years, anticipating the 3rd year, they're doing much better.
And if
They're
you multiply
growing.
that out by
Champions.
25 teams or however many teams we have, then
Right.
that becomes a volatile line too.
Well,
And-
right,
and-
I mean, I think, Mr. Jarvis has actually talked to us about the
Yes.
fact that the great success that so many of our teams have had getting to state championships, et
Funds up
cetera,
expenses for
comes with extra funds that are not
Yes.
part of this line item, that are not things we regularly budget for.
That's exactly right. I do feel better budgeting that.
Yeah, I
Maybe
would
it's
rather
just
budget it.
$2,000, but I
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
I know Mr. Jarvis does as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, my computer just went down, so I think we've lost.
Good night, Ben.
On that note, the spreadsheet I had created had added to $288,000 in reduction, and
Okay. So that would be a total budget of $60,671,831. Is that what you have, Ms. Trudeau? $60,671,831?
Your computer go down too?
See, you know, they laugh at us who use
Yeah.
pens.
I really wish I had my calculator.
Who's in
instead.
operation right now, though?
small victories.
I'll take any victories I can get.
Okay, what did you have?
I had, with the reductions of 288,000, the total would be $60,671,831.
I have $60,675,831.
I have that as well.
Oh, okay.
I have that as well.
Okay, $60,675,831 for a percent increase of 1.98%.
Yep.
Okay.
And I have the content of the amendments the board has made to the budget.
Okay. Then, Mr. Kazin, do you have a motion?
I do. I move that we approve the budget, subject to those line item changes that we just made.
In the total amount of? Whatever.
I was going to ask you to read it, but
$60,675,831.
as stated by Dr. Freeman.
All right. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Any other discussion or comments?
No.
I just want to thank, obviously, the administration for another very thoughtful and careful budget process, although obviously we're not done. This is always one of the more challenging aspects of our job, and I think that Ms. Trudeau and Mr. Bowden and Dr. Freeman and Dr. Keene all work to make it as thoughtful as possible. I guess is the right word, recognizing that we are stewards for the community's resources, and we're expected to try to encourage a positive instructional environment, but at a reasonable cost, and try to further both of those is a challenge. If we were some other towns and we were spending a couple of $1,000s per
$15
student,
million more.
a couple of $1,000s per student more, it'd be a lot easier to have these discussions, but we're already pretty efficient, and And this exercise, I think, shows how, but anyway. So, thank you. And Dr. Hirsch, I assume you abstained, or did you?
I did.
Okay, so we will just note Dr. Hirsch abstention. You'll be able to vote next year, that's okay. It'll give you something to look forward to.
Did we vote?
Did we vote?
No.
No, we did not vote yet.
Okay, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Opposed? And Dr. Hirsch abstains. All
Thank
right,
you all very much. We do appreciate all the
Thank
time
you.
that you put into working on this with us.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you very much.
Am I the guy who has to call Joe tomorrow?